Hello, welcome to Chapter 18, African Before 1800s by Sydney, Glenn, and Marissa.
These are some of the key terms that we will be discussing in Chapter 18 today.
What's an oba?
That's a great question. Oba is an African sacred king.
Oh, that's very interesting. What's masquerades? I thought masquerades was a ball.
Not necessarily in Africa. In Africa, masquerades is kind of like a dancing ceremony where like the participants wear masks and they're possessed. Well, not possessed, but like there's a spirit inside of the person who is doing the masquerade.
What's scarification? Is it like just scarring yourself?
Okay. Well, scarification is beautifying the body through scarring. It's not necessarily self harm, it's a beautifying thing. It's using decorative marks on the human body made by cutting or piercing the flesh to create scars. A lot of tribes would do this in order to identify where they're from or just to make themselves appear more beautiful, kind of like tattoos in America.
Oh, that's very interesting. Could that possibly be where tattoos came from, originated?
Not necessarily, although they do share similar purposes
Oh,
depending on the group of people.
okay.
So, this is a map of West Africa. This is basically where all the artworks we're talking about originated from. So, from Senegal, the Gambia, all the way to Nigeria, this is going to be the relative area that we're going to be speaking about. Most African art dated before 1800 is very hard to date and interpret, unfortunately.
That's very interesting. Why is that?
The reasoning behind it is because many of the peoples in West Africa prior to colonialization did not have a writing system, so we would consider them prehistoric. So they didn't have a reason to write things down because they're a very oral community. Everything was passed down orally.
In ancient Africa, did any of the African cultures have a written language?
So that is a tricky question because in the general sense, no. However, there were a lot of languages or languages that were used for religion, like Gez, which was used in Ethiopia, and Nsibidi, which was used in many of southeastern Nigeria.
Okay. Majority of settlements who lived in Africa were sedentary.
How do you know they were sedentary?
You can tell they are sedentary based on the size of each art piece. The art pieces are very inconvenient to travel with, which solidifies the fact that they are sedentary.
Wow. Oh, so like the Venus of Willendorf, who was the people who made the Venus of Willendorf were like nomadic, so that's why it was smaller. And since they're sedentary, they made more larger pieces.
Yeah.
African art was a stepping stone for modern art.
How?
Most modern art was inspired and built off of past artworks.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Most African art dated before 1800 is very hard to date and interpret.
Oh, is that because of change in landscape?
The people were prehistoric, which is the reason why we don't know when it was dated or when, like, why they made the art. That's why it's hard to interpret and hard to date.
So, rock art was the first form of art recorded in Africa.
Yeah!
Well, one of the first that we know of, or the oldest, Paleolithic rock drawing in Africa is the rounded headed figure from 3000 BC.
That's the one from Niger, no?
Yep, that's the one.
Yes, however, don't forget that the oldest drawings can be traced back to Nambia in the Apollo 11 caves.
The one with the disputed times.
Yes, some historians have more modest time periods of 24,000 to 27,000 years ago, but others are willing to say that the piece is older than 50,000 years ago.
Dang, that's about 5 millennia. Are they willing to say the piece is that old?
Well, there's no writing by the site because the people that made it were still prehistoric. We will have low chances of ever truly finding out when it was made.
Well, I'm surprised that the piece lasted this long. Many African artworks have disappeared over time due to the lack of knowledge and preservation of numerous pieces. The fact that this artwork has lasted for so long is honestly very fortunate.
Very true.
Interestingly enough, African art was the basis for modern art across the globe. Its uniqueness has made it very distinguishable and, by Western standards, it's been seen as distinctly art.
I can see that especially if you talk about the pieces that many African tribes and kingdoms made over the time.
Makes sense though. The majority of people settlements in Africa are sedentary, so they have more time to be dedicated to art.
It's the Nook head from northern Nigeria.
Oh, yes, the heads were made out of terracotta, just like the Etruscans. How many heads were there again?
There are 7 heads in total, however, majority of them are just fragments of figurines. And also, if you look at the screen, you'll see that that is the few heads that are currently preserved.
Oh, yeah, there are seven. I do believe they're created in between 500 BCE to 500 CE.
Yes, it is. It is made from iron rich clay and grog, and they have all been dispersed throughout the Nigerian landscape, mainly where the ancient kingdom of Nok used to be.
Oh, so there are multiples?
Absolutely. Interestingly, though, none of them are really of a specific person. They are instead abstract sculptures. It's predicted that they were made to ward off facial paralysis. The exaggerated nose, eyes, and mouth resemble that of the woman of Willendorf in her exaggerated body figure.
Oh, wow. The Nok people were very advanced. It reminds me of the Ife people in Nigeria.
Have y'all heard of the Lindenberg heads?
Yes, Lindenberg heads were found in the same name district in South Africa.
It has been established that they were buried there in 500 AD.
Which makes them the oldest known African artwork south of the equator.
Little is known of the ancient culture that produced this group of seven heads.
Oh, so similar to the Nok heads, there's seven of them. I wonder if it's significant to African culture.
Continuing on the subject of the Lindenberg heads, one interesting fact to take note of is that they were buried carefully, revealing their significance and how the people regarded these heads as important.
It is predicted that these were masks worn by the people of the time period, and there is no record of these people or tribes to associate them with.
Although different, show similar characteristics like small size of the eyes and ears, but exaggerated lips.
Now, speaking of the Ife terracotta queen with the elaborate headdress, which is dated from 1000 to 1300 CE, these terracotta sculptures have been unearthed by archaeologists in the area of Djenné in Mali and at Ife in Nigeria and date from 1000 to 1300 AD. Now, what's very interesting about this sculpture is its prevalence in other areas. The fact that it was found both in Mali and Ife could either indicate some type of trade going on between the two nations, or could indicate a similar culture being expressed, or just this person was very popular in these areas. Now, powerful terracotta sculptures continued to be made throughout Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. Ife terracotta heads were carved bronze and were mainly portraits of royals from the Yoruba and Mali kingdom. At the time, the people valued them as gods. Now, the people being royals or very affluent people, but I'm mainly speaking about the nobility here, similar to Egypt, where they worshiped their pharaohs, or similar to ancient Samaria, where they had very exalted kings who were close to the divinities. These people are very similar to which, since they were of nobility and they had closer connection to gods or were considered gods, their portraits were highly regarded and respected. Now, there is no hidden meaning to these sculptures, as they are portraying specific individuals and are very naturalistic. The burial compound of Oni Obalufon II reveals that this individual may have been the creator and main sculptor of the Ife terracotta heads. Now, the burial compound of Oni Obalufon isn't currently depicted here, but it did have numerous amounts of these heads. And since they weren't sculptures of himself, and as you can see from the sculpture on the screen, that is very detailed and specific to a certain type of person, this is why they believe that it was this individual that created and sculpted these heads.
In this slide, we'll be talking about the brass figure Oni of Ife, 14th through 15th century. This superb tradition reached its peak with the Ife people from Nigeria, who began to produce very fine brass and bronze castings in the 12th century and continued to the 15th century. Life-size heads and masks and smaller full-length figures achieved astonishing realism and reflected a quiet intensity that was the forerunner to the quality which we now admire so much in traditional African sculpture. Sometimes they are also cast in pure copper, technically much more challenging than brass.
The arrival of the Portuguese ended the use of terracotta as benign sculptors began to produce brass plates with scenes in relief. These plates were nailed as decoration to the wooden pillars of the royal palace.
And that concludes all of the art pieces that were done in Africa before colonialization, or as the title says, Africa before 1800. Thank you so much for watching. I'm pretty sure we all enjoyed doing this, didn't we?
Yes, we
of
did.
course. It was so informational.
Yes, it was. And if you
You all do not mind me asking, before we close out for the audience, what was one of your favorite ones that we went over so far? One of my personal favorites would be the Ife terracotta heads.
Oh, mine was as well. I just appreciated the scratching on the face as an art style and how they created it.
I like I appreciated how realistic they were compared to the other past artworks.
Very true. They had more defined features, especially when compared to the Lindenberg head and the Knock heads.
Yes, correct. And I completely understand. And I honestly, that is probably my second favorite. I would have to say my favorite would be the one I'm looking at right now, the brass plaque. Now, it would have been the Ife one, but the reason why I choose this is because of the ornate detail that they put in the people in the front. You can honestly tell and see a lot of how their culture dressed and just how the Benin people styled their warriors. And I find that quite beautiful.
Yes, I quite like how 3D it is, especially compared to the other thing.
Especially since it's bas relief.
Yes.
Well, well, except for the front. The front might be a little high relief, but most of them are bas relief. Now, as I said, I thank both of y'all for having this lovely conversation about art. And I do hope for the viewers who are watching this, you have learned something quite amazing about Africa. Well, I think we're done, aren't we?
Yes.
Alrighty.
Yes.
Thank you all and have a lovely day.